For most of 2025, this book, which translates to The Country That Became Too Rich, has topped Norway's non-fiction bestseller lists. While there's a pretty widespread consensus that Norway has managed its oil wealth better than basically any other resource-rich country, the book's author, former McKinsey director Martin Beck-Holter, argues that both the public and private sector have essentially become too reliant on this oil money, giving way to a decade of stagnation. So, in this video, we're going to look at the book's basic argument, some of the objections, and try our best to figure out whether Norway has actually become too rich. Have you ever wondered how much money TLDR makes each year? Or who's funding our journalism? Well, we think transparency is super important. So we answer both questions in our recent video. It's linked in the description. So let's get straight into it. Holter splits Norway's economic history into 5 chapters. The first chapter runs from 1905 until 1918, when Norway experienced an industrial boom, helped by massive foreign investment. According to historical data, Norway's industrial production grew by over 6% a year between 1905 and 1918, and Norway went from being the 16th richest country in the OECD to the 10th in terms of GDP per capita. The second chapter runs from 1918 until 1973. During this time, Holter claims that the Norwegian state became too overbearing, deterring further foreign investment and stunting entrepreneurship. This was in part a legacy of the First and Second World Wars, which required the government to play an unprecedented role in planning the war economies. But it was also because Norway suffered 2 acute economic crises in the early 20th century. First, in the mid-20s, when the Norwegian central bank hiked interest rates in a misguided attempt to restore the krone to its pre-World War I rate, and then the Great Depression in the late 20s. These crises were widely perceived as crises of capitalism, and dented Norway's faith in free markets. Norway thus maintained high taxes and strict price controls for most of the 20th century, and adopted an unorthodox policy of super low interest rates, which gave way to chronic inflation. By 1973, just before the first oil crisis struck, Norway had the 4th lowest GDP per capita in the OECD, ahead of just Turkey, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal. The third chapter runs from 1973 until 1991. During this time, 2 things happened. First, Norway's oil boom really kicked off. The oil sector went from nothing in 1975 to accounting for over 15% of GDP and 20% of tax revenues a decade later. These revenues were incredibly well managed by Norway's sovereign wealth fund, which invested heavily in foreign assets. Not only did the return of these investments create a new source of revenue going forward, buying foreign assets also pushed down the value of the Norwegian krone, allowing Norway's other export-oriented industries to stay competitive. The second thing that happened is that, like many other Western countries at the time, Norway moved right on economic issues. This process began in the 80s and 90s, when the Norwegian state privatised certain industries, improved the independence of the central bank, introduced a new competitive authority, liberalised its trading rules, and reformed its tax and banking systems. During this time, the oil boom pushed Norway up the OECD rankings, but Norway's non-oil economy didn't actually improve all that much. The 4th chapter runs from 1990 until 2013. According to Beck-Holter, this is when these pro-market reforms we just mentioned start paying dividends. Obviously, Norway's oil economy was booming, but the key point Beck-Holter wants to make here is that actually Norway's non-oil economy also performed incredibly well in this period. Even if you exclude the oil economy, in 2013, Norway still had the 3rd highest GDP per capita in the OECD, behind only Luxembourg and Switzerland. Norway even had a higher GDP per capita than the US, despite the fact that Norwegians worked about 20% fewer hours. The 5th chapter, however, runs from 2013 until today. According to Beck-Holter, 2013 was essentially the peak, and Norway has been going downhill since. Outside the oil economy, productivity has stagnated. Real wage growth fell to just 0.2% a year, compared to 3% a year between 1990 and 2013. Weak exports, a lack of foreign investment, and persistent inflation have pushed down the krona by an astonishing 50% since 2013. And countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, and Iceland have essentially caught up in terms of GDP per capita. Beck-Holter essentially blames this stagnation on an over-dependence on Norway's oil wealth. He claims, for instance, that Norwegian households take out unsustainable amounts of debt because they know the oil fund can always bail them out at the end of the day, which is why their debt-to-income ratio stands at 220%, the highest in the OECD. Similarly, he claims that the public sector has become more and more reliant on oil revenues, as evidenced by the fact that disbursements from the Sovereign Wealth Fund now account for 20% of government spending, up from about 4% in the 2000s. Beck-Holter claims that voters have become resistant to any sort of public sector reform because they think Norway can just spend its way out of trouble using its oil wealth. This explains why public spending has risen from about 50% of GDP in 2013 to more like 60% today. But this hasn't led to better outcomes. For instance, in the 2010s, the number of health personnel increased in Norway but decreased in Denmark. But Danish health outcomes improved far more than Norwegian ones. Similarly, while Norway spends about 50% more on education than the OECD average, Norwegian schoolchildren actually underperform the OECD average on PISA tests. Finally, Beck-Holter claims too much of this public money is spent on welfare or industrial subsidies, which discourage productive work and shield unprofitable companies from foreign competition. Beck-Holter complains that Norway has become complacent about the extent of these problems, because there's an assumption that there's always the Sovereign Wealth Fund to fall back on. Unsurprisingly, the book has triggered a fair bit of pushback. A number of Norwegian academics and officials have questioned the data Beck-Holter uses, especially his use of GDP statistics from the Madison Project instead of official Norwegian data, which shows a far less dramatic slowdown between the 4th and 5th chapter. Many on the left see Beck-Holter's book, which essentially calls for cuts to public spending and more pro-business regulations, as just another right-wing manifesto dressed up as apolitical research. Perhaps the most difficult objection for Beck-Holter is that his basic claim, that Norway's oil wealth is the root of its current economic problems, isn't easy to square with the fact that most developed countries are having similar problems, with stagnant productivity, falling educational attainment, and rising antipathy towards establishment politicians. Nonetheless, the fact that the book has attracted so much interest inside Norway suggests it's tapped into a relatively widespread sentiment in the country, and that, even if Norwegians don't think of themselves as too rich, they're still not wholly satisfied with the direction the country's going in, and there's a sense that Norway's political class should be doing better with the money it's got. Everything we've discussed in today's video plays into a broader sense of uncertainty in the world at the moment. And who's so often in the middle of all that? Well, the United States. So in the next issue of our magazine Too Long, we're discussing this geopolitical shift, and whether we're currently observing the end of the American order. In that section, we discuss everything from the collapse of democratic norms in the US to the decline in American soft power, to issues with the US economy or the battle for universities, before discussing who could potentially take over in a post-America world. So if you want to find out what we really think, now's your chance. It's not just the US though. This issue is our longest ever at 78 pages, full of our very best journalism and analysis. So we also get into why Germany's military might is growing, if Farage could become the UK's Prime Minister, why countries are outsourcing their migrants, why the global order is collapsing with Professor James Kerr-Lindsay, and why leaders like Putin and Netanyahu seem to be getting away with it. The magazine has now been officially published, so if you order a copy today, we'll ship it to you as soon as we can. Or if you select the digital edition, we'll send a digital version of Too Long straight to your inbox. Plus, if you want the best deal, make sure that you subscribe to Too Long. That way, not only do you get every issue going forward, you'll also get 20% off every copy as long as you're a member. On top of that, this week only, if you use code LASTCHANCE20, you'll get an additional 20% off this copy, bringing down the cost from £9.99 to £6.40 for a digital edition, or £13.99 to £8.96 for a physical edition. This really is your last chance too. From next week, all new subscribers won't receive this issue of Too Long, instead having to wait until December's The New Middle East issue. So if you want the reduced subscriber pricing on this issue, this really is your last chance. As we outlined in our recent video on TLDR's finances, TLDR actually made a loss last year, and too long is a big part of our plan to make TLDR profitable in 2025 to continue funding the free videos we release every day. So if you want to be part of that, then head to toolong.news and subscribe today. We really appreciate your support.